Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about conflict, conflict between governmental bodies, conflicts of interest, and other news like that. The City Council, the Planning Commission, and the School Board all got into some debates and fracasses this week, so we thought we'd talk about that. To start off with, conflict is a natural part of the governing and democratic process. There's competing interests and ideas, but we've seen this week some ethical, financial, and political issues being raised. Gennady, let's talk about the City Council and the Planning Commission first. What happened at the council meeting?
Well, this sort of conflict between the City Council and Planning Commission has been simmering against since late last year, but this week it sort of rose to the surface during what was scheduled to be a very routine discussion of a colleague's memo relating to secondary dwelling units or granny units or accessory units or whatever you want to call them. Typically, these discussions last like 5 minutes. A memo is brought out, they decide to send it to a committee, and then that's it. And because it's a zoning issue, the typical process is the Planning Commission would discuss it first, issue a recommendation, then would go to the council. In this case, the conversation kind of went to a surprising direction when a couple of council people made a point that they no longer have confidence in the Planning Commission and that the process should be changed because they don't feel the Planning Commission could properly frame it and that it would be inefficient to send this issue to a group that seems to be so out of alignment, as one councilman put it, with the City Council.
And this is the first time that the idea of taking an issue and not going to the commission has surfaced this year, hasn't it?
It's the first time it's surfaced in 14 years, at least. That's what Karen Holman, former planning commissioner, now councilwoman, she said she doesn't recall this ever happening in her terms of service, and yeah, it certainly hasn't happened this year before. It's typical for committees to vet it before council when it's things outside of zoning, but this is sort of the reason the Planning Commission exists. So.
Yeah.
This was council member Filseth that brought this up initially, and then
Yes.
Du Bois agreed with it. Did you get the impression that this was spontaneous or a calculated issue being raised?
I did not get a sense that this was spontaneous. I think it's something that they've thought about it for a long time. I think it's something that was brought up by Cheryl Lewisstein, like maybe a few months ago, or a separate item. And she is the president of Palo Alto for Sensible Zoning, which is a citizens group with which both Filseth and Du Bois are affiliated with. And to some extent, this goes back to the election of Filseth and Du Bois and the fact that the week after they were elected, the lame duck council made those appointments. So they've had many months to think about it and simmer and kind of see how these conversations are going. I feel like right now, it's kind of more timely for these comments to come out because the Planning Commission just went through a period in which it discussed these really big issues like the office cap, PC zoning. So if there's ever a time for Filseth and Du Bois to say, see, all our biggest fears have come true, this would be the time. So they did.
Yeah. This was pretty late at night too, wasn't it?
It was around 11:45, 11:30.
When people perhaps are being more candid.
Yeah, I think it was just me and
points.
Borak at that point. Yeah, they were candid. Yeah, the council was pretty candid.
Yeah. So Filseth, it sounded like he initially was suggesting that the commission's just left out altogether, but really what they ended up with talking about was having it go to Policy and Services, the council's committee, for shaping first.
Yeah, it was a pretty quick reversal. He initially just said, instead of Planning Commission, let's have the council's PSC, Policy Services Committee, evaluated. But as soon as he said it, some other member of the council, I think it might have been the mayor, Holman, said, wait, do you mean just completely cut him out or just... and then he kind of conceded. He's like, okay, fine, let's have PSC do it first and then the Planning Commission. So he kind of reversed himself on that quickly, but the motivation was kind of the same. Give Planning Commission a lesser role, make sure that their scope is more limited, make sure that they get the proper direction.
How did the council members who aren't aligned with the newly elected members react to this?
Oh, they actually, they were very critical of their colleagues. They thought it was completely inappropriate to kind of talk about Planning Commission in these terms so late at night when they're not there to defend themselves. Greg Shaw and Mark Berman both kind of made a case that this kind of discussion is very inappropriate, that, these are citizen volunteers, and Berman actually said, I wouldn't serve on one of our commissions if I knew the council was kind of impugning our credibility. So they kind of came out against it, and even the people who supported Phyllis and Du Bois were, their criticism of the commission was much more measured, if not, in Greg Schmidt's case, non-existent. It was more of a process issue for him. But yeah, the statements were pretty controversial, and they did split the council.
So this failed on a 4-4 vote,
That's
right?
correct. Pat Burr was
And
absent.
Pat Burr was absent. So
Yeah.
do you have any sense of how Burt would have voted on this? Because it's interesting that the mayor voted not to change this procedure and instead to send it to the planning commission.
Oh,
right?
actually,
Didn't she oppose
no, the mayor
procedure?
actually supported it. Yeah, it was the mayor and Greg Schmidt who they voted along with.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So they were very much in alignment of kind of what we normally think of as the kind of.
So
two
Burr would have
council.
been the swing vote, as he sometimes is on these kinds of issues.
Yeah, he would have been the swing vote, and while it's hard for me without speaking to him to predict how he would have voted, I should point out that in a past discussion, Burt has been the most critical of all the council people on this, what he perceives to be a lack of alignment. So, based on that, we could sort of guess.
When he was on the planning commission, and I was covering the land use beat, he was the first to say he doesn't want the commission to be spending 6 months vetting any issue, looking in detail, only to have that decision be swung in the opposite direction by the city council, because they, of course, have a broader view, and they're also, observing the political winds, I think is what they were saying at the time.
Well, and that kind of goes to the crux of this whole issue, where the council believes it has given some fairly explicit direction in terms of what it wants the planning commission to consider, and it doesn't really want to get back a whole bunch of noise on the edges of that go to the underlying policy questions.
Right. And I think, both sides have kind of, they're portraying, the critics of the Planning Commission are saying, Du Bois and Phil said basically that this is a body that's now kind of trying to set its own policies, kind of taking a different view. The commissioners I spoke to for the story are basically saying, we're very technical, we're outside of the political process. And I don't think either statement is entirely true. I think, I don't think they're completely technical. I think some members are, very much delve into the details of the ordinance and don't have any kind of, big ideological shifts. But I think some clearly do. And, if you say you're going to be technical, but then during your meetings you're going to make kind of statements, like kind of broad statements, and bring up issues that are not part of the ordinance, like kind of removing the 50-foot height limit, which was not part of the PC proposal before. You kind of, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, we're purely technical, but then also make these kinds of statements.
Yeah. Has the Planning Commission responded to some of the council's redirection of the issues? Because I know the council's voted against recommendations that the Planning Commission has done in the last year or so. Have you heard from the Planning Commissioners any upset, any frustration with that kind of process being overruled?
It comes up here and there. I mean, when they were talking about the office cap, initially they just weren't going to approve it at all, even though the city council already kind of conceptually approved it unanimously. It was like a meeting. There were 4 commissioners present, and finally, on the second go around, they did approve it. But those who supported it also hated the proposal, and their reasoning was, the council kind of said that they want to do it, so we'll do our part to try to kind of mitigate the damage. But and in a sense, that's a response to the council's direction. But But as far as the broader direction of the reason we want the PC zone reformed is because people are angry about these PC projects, and that kind of contextual stuff. I don't think there's been much of a response. I think they pretty much approached each issue as an individual issue.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about who the planning commissioners are, because I think that might lead us a little bit into the topic of conflict of interest and just some questions that have been raised by the public about who's on it and what other roles they may play.
Yeah, the 2 veterans on the commission are Greg Tanaka and Mark Michael that have been there for like 5 years or so. Each have worked in the revision of the comp plan for a while. And neither of them I see as very ideological. Mark Michael has been speaking in recent months, maybe the last couple of years, about the need to build more housing, even if it means changing R1 zoning, which very few people are willing to go there, but that's kind of as far as he gets. He also supports not having a 50-foot height limit for some big projects. So he does have some kind of pro-growth leanings in that sense, but most of their comments tend to be focused on kind of
On the technical.
ordinance, technical details. Then there's Michael Alchik, who I think is kind of on the furthest end of the spectrum of kind of advocating for pro-development policies. I feel like almost every issue he approaches through the lens of what is this going to do to a developer's ability to build things like
Is he
that.
a real estate attorney?
He is. Yeah, good point. Yeah, why do you bring that up? So, and then that's three. And we have two members from Palo Alto Forward. That's Kate Downing and Eric Rosenblum, both high-tech employees. Eric Rosenblum works for Palantir. Kate Downing used to work for VMware, but no longer does. She now works outside the city. And yeah, Prisma Gardias is one of the newer commissioners, and I see him as being completely technical, and I don't think he's dissented on several issues from the rest of the commission, but yeah, he really delves into details, and I see him to be as kind of the least political of the group right now.
Okay.
I should also point out they're going to appoint someone new this upcoming Monday, so we'll see how that shifts the dynamic.
So some people on Town Square, our online discussion forum, have raised the question of people participating in advocacy groups at the same time that they're serving on a commission or a board. And we were having a discussion earlier in the newsroom about, well, where do people come from if they're interested in civic government? They generally tend to lean one way or another. Is it that unusual for people to be in a leadership capacity of a group and at the same time serving?
Well, I don't think it's unusual. First of all, I should also point out Adrian Fine is the one member I didn't mention when I was going through the roster. He works for Nextdoor, also newly elected. He was elected last November.
Okay.
I don't think it's that unusual because you have to think about the fact that there's a very limited pool of people willing to do this, volunteer on Wednesday nights. To be part of this limited pool, you already have to be really impassioned and care about the issues and be willing to take criticism, be willing to read on Town Square, people kind of bashing you sometimes, have to counsel every now and then impugn what you're doing. So it's not a very big pool, and I feel like the people who get involved are, in many cases, already kind of involved in these issues. And it's not just the commission. I mean, if you look at the council, you have Eric Filseth and Tom Du Bois who are affiliated with PAS. I mean, it's like, if you're just going to bar people from participating in these citizen groups or participating in kind of civic service, then it's kind of a tough line to draw.
Yeah, it's
Do you know if
interesting.
there are any guidelines or rules that are intended to make this clear to commissioners so that any of our volunteer commissioners, if they are the heads or on the steering committees of outside organizations, that they're expected to relinquish those roles? Because it's one thing to be an advocate, it's another thing to be in a leadership capacity of a group that's advocating for a point of view before the very body that you're serving on.
Right, yeah, and honestly, I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to read the exact kind of application for the, but
Yeah, it's interesting.
but Du Bois and Filseth are both part of the leadership of PAS, so it would be the same kind of standard. It would be,
Yeah, it was interesting that the website for PAS actually doesn't seem like it was updated since the campaign last November, but has a little note for both of them saying that they're on sabbatical from the leadership group.
during the city council campaign, though. It doesn't
Yeah,
say,
it
doesn't say
hadn't
during the
been
city
updated
council
since.
term, so it's
It's a little ambiguous.
We'll have to ask
it's
them about
ambiguous.
that.
But to the larger point, I feel like throughout the history, you've had people who participated in these kind of grassroots efforts,
Sure.
attaining leadership. I mean, we were just talking about Dick Rosenbaum a little while ago, who became a leader from leading this group to stop the superblock. And, it's hard to draw the line between civic participation and taking these kind of positions. So.
Yeah. Something maybe a little bit more clear is just the conflict of interest when it comes to financial interests. And it seems like we've come up against this issue a number of times, certainly with the city council. Tom Du Bois was weighing in and not weighing in, and then weighing in on the issues having to do with office cap because his wife works for Stanford Research Park. So the question that people are asking is, does the conflict of interest rule apply to commissioners as well?
The answer is yes, it does. We've had several instances in which commissioners have had to recuse themselves for discussions. Commissioner Gardias had to recuse himself because his wife works for, I think, an architect who was an applicant on some project, so he just left the room. I know Eric Rosenblum has in the past stepped out of the room. I'm not sure which issues. It might have been related to downtown parking. He lives downtown north. But they have been stepping out, so it should apply.
So Rosenblum works for Palantir.
Correct.
Kate Downing's husband works for Palantir as
Also
well.
correct.
That's downtown.
Yes.
So that's been raised as a question of whether or not there's some sort of financial interest. I think there's a layer that's interesting, which is that the conflict of interest law talks about anyone who uses their position to influence a governmental decision in which he knows he has a financial interest. So is a recommending body actually making a government decision, or are they simply recommending, policy to the council, which is then making the decision? It seems like if they've already been recusing themselves, then they see themselves as making enough of a decision or having enough of an influence.
Yeah, it's going to be hard for me to parse the legality of it.
Yeah, well, you're not a lawyer, I know.
It depends on, especially on camera. I become even less of a lawyer. But yeah, it depends what you mean by decision. Is a recommendation a decision? Do we decide to recommend, in which case the stricter standard would apply? Or is a recommendation not a decision? It's just kind of advice from a commission. And I mean, if I had to guess, I would say it is a decision, because otherwise, why would the members have to recuse themselves on other matters? So just for consistency's sake, it seems to me it would be much clearer is if there's a possibility of a conflict, they should always be recusing kind of on the safe side.
Yeah.
But has someone made a distinction between why it is that Tom Du Bois has to recuse himself because his wife works at Stanford on an issue such as the office cap affecting Stanford Research Park, but these two planning commissioners don't have to do that on items that affect the zoning and policies in downtown Palo Alto?
No, I have not heard that
That just
explanation.
doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I haven't heard that explanation.
Yeah, it seems like an unequal application of
Right.
conflict of interest. Yeah. Well, all fascinating issues around that. I want to turn to another fascinating issue that came up this week on the school board beat. Superintendent Max McGee made a decision that was a little bit surprising. Why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. So he wrote in a weekly update last Friday that he's going to postpone the hiring of general counsel, which is a new in-house legal position that the board approved in June. And they had put out applications. I think they had a few candidates. They were talking about the interview panels, and then last Tuesday at the last board meeting, they had an agenda item to talk about the reporting structure for this new hire at the request of Camille Townsend, one board member. They're discussing, so there's this famous dotted line to the board, which there's a few interpretations of what that should mean, or direct report to the superintendent, or as Camille wanted, just a direct report to the superintendent and basically no relationship with the board. So they had a sort of extended conversation about that, and after that, Max made this decision to delay it because it seemed too contentious. There was some confusion around it, and he just wanted to put it off until next year.
He said he was disheartened.
Yeah, and he said, I asked what he meant by that. He wouldn't explain it further. He just said that was exactly what I wrote it down. That's how I felt. And it was a strange discussion just because, which Ken Dauber brought up in the meeting, this relationship is already outlined in board bylaw and in California Education Code, which basically lays out how the board should interact with any attorney, whether they're internal or external. So,
And those bylaws state that, for one thing, not any single individual board member can just go to the attorney and...
Right, it's only the board president or if a majority of the board agrees on communicating with them. So those relationships are already governed and laid out and very clear. And there was some confusion around that and how that would actually work with this new position.
So the question is, what is a dotted line? What does a dotted line mean?
Yeah, so...
Do people have different interpretations of that? I mean, has it been put out there?
I think it's clear. I mean, people understand, Max would manage this person, communicate with them on a day-to-day basis. And if they read the bylaw, they should understand it's only Melissa Baden-Caswell, the president, who communicates directly with them for legal advice, as with any other attorney.
Under authority of the entire board, or
Right.
when the entire board directs.
Yeah, and I
her.
think she can also seek it directly.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure. And it is worth pointing out that Camille is the only board member who voted against this position when they took action in June, and then she requested that this conversation about the reporting structure come to the board last week. And she was the only one who also said, I would like only a direct report to the superintendent. Everyone else was more or less okay with the dotted line relationship.
So what is your concern with the dotted line? Okay, so the proposal is you have the attorney, solid line to superintendent, dotted line to the board. So what exactly does she think is wrong with that?
She expressed some concern that she called this a very political position, expects them to be dealing with very political issues like OCR and Title IX, and wants them to be completely independent and to be able to make independent decisions. And also has repeatedly expressed concerns that they're going to be a generalist. They're not going to have the special focus and knowledge that a Title IX case might require, and so the district is still going to need to rely on its external law firms for that kind of help. So
That seems like a broader criticism of having this general counsel position. But what's her position on lines? Does she want 2 solids, 2 dotted?
she wants one
half
solid
dotted?
to max.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
No dotted.
Just insulated from. Okay.
What her concerns don't seem to take into account is the fact that there is no distinction in the law or in policies between having an outside law firm and having an inside attorney. In both cases, the client is the school board, not the superintendent, the school board, because it's the district as a whole that's being represented by those attorneys. So the issues are getting kind of confused by acting as though the creation of this general counsel position in some way creates a new question about reporting. The law and the board policies say that the school board itself is in this unique situation with legal counsel, is the body that appoints the legal advisor, whether it's outside or inside. So basically, I think this appears to just be another way of trying to head off this desire on McGee's part to create a general counsel. The bigger question, the mystery really, is why the 4 people on the board that agree with McGee to establish this position, why is it that the one dissenting board member is, in the end, determining the outcome of this situation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never heard anybody fight so hard to deprive themselves of access to a lawyer. Anyway.
Well, I also kind of wonder what authority Max has to just postpone this hiring. I mean, the board's already approved it, so how come he, as opposed to the board, is the one who is going to be pushing it off till May? Was that?
He originally said May, and then I spoke with him this week, and he said first quarter of the calendar year in 2016. But they're
so
going to have to
that's-
restart the application process, basically. And so,
I guess that takes a while.
I mean, he described it sort of as a recommendation, but most of the board members I spoke to were fine with it, even those who voted to approve the position in June.
Has he said how the delay is going to solve anything? Is he thinking that just temperatures will go down?
I think so. That's kind of what he said to me this week. I asked that too. What's going to change between now and January or May or whenever to clear up this confusion and disagreement? And that was basically what he said. I forget what the ending quote in the story was, but it was along those lines. And also he said, we have a lot on our plate for the rest of the fall and winter, and wants to focus on other things.
People will get tired of talking about the dotted line. It will vanish.
Be the despairing line. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see how that shapes up when it comes back in the first quarter of the calendar year. There's one other conflict that really has been behind the scenes that we wanted to touch upon this week, which is the relationship between the city of Palo Alto and Stanford University when it comes to fire protection services, which the city's been providing to Stanford. Gennady, you got copies of some letters that have been going back and forth between the city and Stanford. There's been kind of a protracted disagreement over the terms of their contract. What's happening at this point?
Well, it's been a conflict that's been kind of brewing behind the scenes for 2.5 years now. And just as background, 2012, the Slack fire station, which is like technically Menlo Park, but Palo Alto Fire Service, fire department has been, had a station there for many years. In 2012, it closed. And
This is the Stanford Linear Accelerator up
Yes.
on Sand Hill Road on the way to 280.
Yes, thank you. So it closed, and then they've basically been fighting ever since about how that should impact how much Stanford pays to the fire department for the services it provides. And very little has happened. I mean, 2.5 years, and it feels like the two sides are still very far apart. And throughout this time, things kind of escalated. At one point, Stanford went shopping for a different fire service provider, but there were no takers.
Except Palo Alto.
except Palo Alto. There was a kind of a notice that Stanford's going to file a claim against the city, and that was more recent, and that's kind of where things stand.
Yeah, it's really an
Fighting
issue of
over the
money. I thought it was interesting that the service itself, the quality of service, was not questioned either by Stanford or Palo Alto. I mean, Gene McCallan of Stanford said that they're perfectly happy with the staffing, and they did a study of staffing levels, and they seemed adequate.
Yeah, that was kind of one of the big mysteries for me when Stanford went in 2013, notified the city that it wants to get out of the contract and went ahead with its request for proposals. It was kind of a mystery to many people why this is happening because I couldn't get a hold of Stanford at that time to explain it to me. So it was always kind of just, I wasn't sure what the deal was. It became clear this week after reading the documents that it's pretty much all about the money, and both sides have confirmed that it's like, Stanford really has no issues with the service has been receiving from the Palo Alto Fire Department. Stanford recently did its own analysis of the staffing levels at the station, and their independent consultants found that the city's methodology is perfectly fine. And so it just basically comes down to money. And right now, the two sides are about $1.5 million apart as far as annual charges.
Yeah.
The most surprising thing to me about this was Stanford's attempt to collect back compensation for having overpaid for services. Wasn't all this covered in the contract? I mean, they've got a contract. It must spell out the method by which the payments are going to be made. How are they able to then ask for a refund, basically?
Well, I feel the contract is a little vague. I don't have the wording in front of me actually, but it talks about that basically Stanford will be charged kind of a proportionate amount for the service the school receives compared to what the city receives. I'm not getting the wording right, but it doesn't set out like an exact formula. And every once in a while, the university and the city revisit this clause and kind of consider what the amount should be. And in 2005, 2006, 10 years ago, was the last time they looked at it. They determined that 30% is appropriate. There were two stations, of course, then. Now there's only one Palo Alto station serving Stanford on Sarah. But in 2005, they kind of basically agreed that 30% is the figure, which is about $7.4 million a year. And since then, it hasn't really been revised. And I think if Stanford opts out of the contract, I don't think the firefighters just stop serving it. I mean, I think it just kind of extends the current agreement until something else has come up. It's almost like a month-to-month lease. And so as long as that's happening, Stanford is still paying the rate agreed to in 2004, 2005. But because the Slack station closed in mid-2012, Stanford is arguing we should
Whose
get...
decision was it to close the Slack station?
I think it was Slack's decision, actually. I think it was I think Slack...
And that's operated by the Department of Energy.
Correct, yeah.
So it gets pretty complicated.
It does get complicated. Yeah, I think Slack notified Stanford, which notified the city. This was like early 2012. They were going to close it like in July. They ended up closing it a few months even earlier.
And so Stanford continued to pay the regular payments and then only recently has said they want a refund?
Well, no.
Or have they paid under protest, basically, for the last...
They've been pretty much paying under protest, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they've been making the case since the closure that, so...
Right. Okay.
Yeah, has the fire station on Sarah not been servicing the same area, however, that used to be serviced by two different stations? I mean, I assume that there's not part of the Stanford land that's being unserviced at this point, just because the Station 7's gone.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard anything about there being gaps in coverage, but in addition to Palo Alto, obviously Slack is outside the city's borders and it's in Menlo Park, so there could be other agencies serving that area too, like the Menlo Park Fire Protection District. So, but yeah, I don't think there's any gaps in coverage as a result of the decision.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's probably they put some thinking into before they decided to close that station.
I'm sure they did. So Monday night, there's a closed session on the council's part, correct?
Yeah, after the meeting, they're gonna. That should be a fun discussion. I'm not sure what time the meeting's going to end, but then they're going to go into closed session to discuss fire charges.
Okay.
So,
and Stanford and the city are moving into mediation.
yeah, and that's going
At
to
some
be
point.
that's going to be the main topic of discussion. Stanford put the city on notice that it's considering a claim, but they've entered into what's called a tolling agreement, meaning the statute of limitations is going to be suspended while they try to work things out outside the court system. And so the fire chief and basically city attorneys are going to go to the city council in a closed session this week to get some direction about how they should negotiate once it goes into mediation, what the limits would be.
Okay. Well, that wraps up our conflict edition, War and Peace without the peace. So you can check out all the news on paloaltoonline.com or check us out on Twitter at Palo Alto Weekly.